Okay, so we're back, I think. Um, so right now we have um, the recording of Pascal Michael, who is presenting in this video psychedelia and interspecies transcommunication, discussing how the renaissance in psychedelic science has already had a significant role in turning on people to the ecological emergencies we're presently facing. Since psychedelics are also known to be possibly psi-conductive, experiencers' set settings could be primed for either special ecological insight or intentions for ecological resolution. Pascal is currently pursuing a PhD in psychology at the University of Greenwich with Dr. David Luke, where his research mainly encompasses qualitative content analysis of mystical type human experiences, both psychopharmacological and spontaneous, specifically the psychedelic named DMT experience and the near death experience. As such, Pascal's interests lie in death and dying as an entangled continuum existing at the level of molecular, humanistic, and transpersonal level. So, without further ado, let's get into the video.
My name is Pascal Michael, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Greenwich. My PhD is really specifically looking at the nature of psychedelic, especially DMT experiences, and how they are entangled with different dimensions of near-death experiences, specifically. I'm just going to share my screen with you all now to start my talk. So I trust that you can all see my slides at the moment. So yes, my talk is going to be called Psi-chedelia. So that's in reference to the relationship between psychedelics and parapsychological phenomena. And how psychedelics are potentially psi-conducive, and I'll be looking at a little bit of the evidence of that. But also, as per the actual topic of today, how this then relates to other phenomena such as interspecies communication, and then I'll also be talking about the entity encounter, especially within the context of the near-death experience and also some of the alien abduction experience. So to really dive in then. So what I also could have named my talk is para-ecodelia. So this trinity really between psychedelics, ecopsychology, and parapsychology. So really, this triad really is already subsumed by the ancient practice of shamanism. If we're looking toward potential, modern technologies, psi-based technologies, as to how to mitigate and understand the ecological problems that we're presently facing, such as climate change, etc. Shamanism essentially is the first place to look toward. So according to Nabi, at least psychedelic plant or fungi using shamans, they're always animistic. They're attempting to dialogue with nature, and this is really embodied in the encountering of plant spirits. So that in and of itself being a cornerstone of this type of shamanism, it synergizes the use of these psychedelics with ecology and these parapsychological components to it, transpersonal interactions. So it's all for the purpose of maintaining that coherence between the social and natural worlds, which evidently we have presently lost. So they also explicitly ask these plant spirits for assistance. And that can be, for instance, for asking them to actually identify plants to heal specific illnesses, or asking them for the transmission of lessons and teachings. And a good example of this is how the DMT containing plants such as Psychotria viridis, and then the beta carbolines, which are present in the ayahuasca vine, how these were actually combined. How is it known to combine them in the Amazon rainforest to make ayahuasca? And according to the indigenous, it was the asking of the plants, the plant spirits which told them to do so. Again, in a very direct way, the shamans can enact like meteorological manipulations, like classic like rain dancing. That David Luke, for instance, is already preparing a weather control study with the Waradica shamans of Mexico. So, but these shamanistic practices are experiencing a neo-shamanic like movement in the West. And Metzner on this topic has said that the revival of shamanic practices and this animistic worldview can be seen as part of a worldwide human response to the degradation of ecosystems and the biosphere. And a good kind of example, a very good example of this with its transpersonal elements as well is Gail Bradbrook, and it was through her ceremonies with ayahuasca and iboga, where she prayed for the so-called codes of social change, that she ultimately founded Extinction Rebellion, one of the fastest moving eco activist movements in recent times. And this was via suddenly meeting a eco-activist and radical campaign designer who himself then repeated the codes of social change independently term to her. So looking at the relationship specifically between psychedelics and nature connectedness, so leaving out the para kind of part just for the moment. So this term was coined by Richard Doyle. It could be seen in the same way as psychedelic means soul revealing or manifesting. This could mean the manifesting of the natural world. So he defined it as the conviction that one is involved in a densely interconnected ecosystem for which contemporary tactics of human identity are insufficient. A good early example of this kind of and classic example of this kind of nature connectedness under psychedelics is Huxley in The Doors of Perception, when he took mescaline, and he said, "I was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of creation, the miracle, moment by moment of naked existence." Also Hoffman, the synthesizer of LSD, he said that his mystical experience of nature, which he had as a child, was absolutely like an LSD experience. So you know, he also said about this initial child experience, there was almost a preempting and a kind of asking of LSD to discover it, and that it's fascinating that was deeply within a natural context, and the experiences were so alike. So in terms of surveys which have been done, so Luke and Katenis found that actually the commonest transpersonal experience with natural psychedelics such as mushrooms, ayahuasca, salvia, was the encountering of the spirit or intelligence of this plant or fungus. And then a later survey that Luke also conducted, finding that 16% of participants reporting on their psilocybin mushroom experience reported an encounter or communication with the spirit of the fungus, and then 10% reporting a transformation into other species. In terms of the actual repercussions that these people reported about their experiences on psychedelics, was that all of them said that they had an increased connection to nature. 80%, the majority, said that their actual interaction with nature increased, and then over 60% reported that their concern for nature had also elevated. Very importantly, I think the majority said that they improved their diet as a result of their experiences, and mostly to a veggie or vegan diet. And that's quite crucial, because there's been a UN statistic recently that all of the transport industry combined has actually less of a greenhouse gas and ecological adverse impact than the animal agriculture industry in itself. Recent research involves more surveys and more sophisticated prospective studies. So the finding that lifetime psychedelic use actually predicts one's relatedness to nature, and that essentially is mediated by the extent of dissolution of the ego, and that's also something that is characteristically found in the clinical psychedelic studies. The higher ego dissolution, the lower the symptoms. Similarly, psychedelic lifetime use mediated via increased nature relatedness predicted pro-environmental behavior. So essentially, the more people are using psychedelics, and the more their connectedness to nature, and therefore the more they are actually doing something to protect nature. In an actual perspective study, a clinical study for psilocybin for depression in Imperial, nature relatedness was found to increase even up to a year after their single experience. And importantly, these depressed patients significantly decreased in their depression, so there may well be an interrelationship between mood and nature relatedness. And indeed, this is something that later studies further explored, such as the following. that nature relatedness was increased up to 2 years post psychedelic experience. This was a prospective online study, but that itself was dependent on, again, extent of ego dissolution, as well as the natural surroundings and connections to them. And that was ultimately correlated with psychological well-being. So this study quite nicely reflecting all of the previous results of these other studies. So now turning to the relationship between parapsychological phenomena and psychedelics, so leaving out the eco dimension just for now. Lots of these, I'm not going to go through them all in detail. I've selected, handpicked the most impressive, to my mind, of different sources of evidence for psychedelics being potentially psi-conducive, and this is mainly from David Luke's comprehensive study of paranormal experiences with psychoactive drugs, 2012. So the important point here being, if ultimately this event today is exploring how parapsychology essentially could have any theoretical application to climate crises, etc. And I'm advocating for psychedelics being having a fundamental role in that conversation. How is it then that psychedelics might be conducive to these extrasensory, etc. Effects? So looking at the earlier years, more anthropological studies of psychedelics, the kind of classic one to mention is when harmine, which is which is the key active constituent in the ayahuasca vine, was synthesized. Its first name telepathy, and it was based on Bayon's report of Colonel Morales, who had a vision when using ayahuasca of his not at that moment dead father and sick sister, and then a month later, when they were many days from the furthest outpost, so non-parapsychological means are highly unlikely, this was actually confirmed. In terms of clinical research, it was done in like the early waves of psychedelic research. Charles Tart, quoting International Foundation of Advanced Studies, showing that at hundreds of these psychedelic therapy sessions, the incidence of extrasensory perception, with not just any evidence but strong evidence, was 7, and that really is considerably higher than what happens, as it were, compared to a control, which was non-psychedelic psychotherapy. One really interesting one to point out, in my opinion, is a very early one. Paul in 1966, reporting on the use of Amanita pantherina, same genus as Amanita muscaria, and this psychiatrist experienced an apocalyptic vision, but then leading to salvational experience and scenes, which involved this sense of overwhelming love. And at the very same moment as she was having this experience, 2 of her patients had an amnesia, but then later reported one of them the apocalyptic fear and visions mirroring that of the psychiatrist, and then this other patient actually lingering around a lover's house, love struck, so again mirroring this sense of overwhelming love that the psychiatrist had. So interesting phenomenology reported there. In terms of experimental studies in the early waves, again, an interesting potential insight that lifetime marijuana use in an early study was highly correlated with symbol guessing scores in a ESP symbol guessing protocol, but then this being potentially, well, certainly bolstered in the principle of it. More recently, Luke finding that lifetime psychedelic use very significantly correlated with scores on a precognition protocol. With clairvoyance, looking at that specifically, there was an interesting study by Friedman and Fisher in the 60s, in 1960, which potentially was arguably not precisely an ESP study, but they found that when an image was obscured somewhat below the threshold of consciousness, the descriptions that participants gave as to what the image was significantly more accurate under the LSD condition. And while that might be subliminal perception. And while David Luke did suggest that this could be a genuine ESP effect, it could also be that it's a matter of visual acuity, because we know the psychedelics also lead to that. But there's an interesting relationship between just unconscious perception and ESP. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive by any means. For instance, when thinking about the first sight concept of the theory for mechanism for psi in being an actually originally unconscious process in itself. But moving on, interestingly, the person that coined the word psychedelic, Humphrey Osmond, he and colleague Blewett reported that under the influence of mescaline, they communicated telepathically extremely successfully, to the point that a bystander started to have a kind of panic attack at the uncanniness of the success of the exchange. Another interesting study in the 60s, Puharich, again with Amanita muscaria, finding that in a sender-receiver telepathy protocol, at baseline, the score was just a chance, but then during the acute Amanita drug condition, it was highly significant, the hit rate, and then it went back down to chance post-trip. And just neuropharmacologically, it's interesting that muscimol is the active ingredient. Really, the ibotenic acid is a pre-drug, so it ultimately becomes muscimol as well, and that is a very potent GABA A agonist. So it has this anesthetic property. It puts the individual into a hypnotic trance ultimately. So of course I could go on and on with these particular studies. Again, this is just another survey by Luke and Katenis, and this shows multiple different drugs and then a list of all the different paranormal type experiences that were reported, and we can see there's a real host of them, and things like MDMA are particularly good at inducing telepathy. Things like cannabis and ketamine are particularly good at inducing OBE or clairvoyant-like experiences, and psilocybin mushrooms, actually, compared to the other ones, although it's low down here, has a tendency of inducing precognitive experiences. Not surprisingly, entity encounters on DMT, death-type encounters, again, on ketamine and 5-MeO, and plant communication between the most kind of characteristic plant-based psychedelics, such as ayahuasca and salvia. Again, just lastly, David Luke and myself and some others co-ran a study just the other year, looking at the potential induction of precognition, in part by the use of DMT. And ultimately, you can see on this graphic that, in short, the DMT condition yielded much higher, or significantly higher, score in the DMT condition compared to the non-DMT condition. Ultimately, the thing with that is that we're not certain if it was the DMT or the fact of it being the experimental condition, because there was not it was not placebo controlled. Again, we did another insight study to determine if there can be useful information which is extracted from the DMT space, and we had one participant at least who was a toxicologist and allegedly felt that he envisioned particles interacting in the human lung on both a physical and chemical level in order to enact damage. This is like plastic and other type of microparticles which can cause damage, and he felt that it gave him information and insight which was not known at the time. Now turning to interspecies communication, can psychedelics induce these kinds of experiences, and what can be gained from them? So Luke, in an earlier paper, he described his use of salvia divinorum, and basically what I've sort of labeled as phytanthropy, which is the turning into transforming into plants. So he turned into a bush, and then he also goes on to describe how he heard all the plants around him laugh at him, mocking him, kind of diminishing his ego. And then he had this transpersonal communication with seemingly kind of all-encompassing nature spirit telling him how arrogant and destructive human beings are. Paul Stamets, famous mycologist, has said about psychedelic mushrooms and the messages that we can receive through them, that we're part of an ecology of consciousness, that the earth is in peril, time is short, and we're part of a universal biosystem. And there's also another thing he notes, a quite interesting observation, that when actually these psychedelic mushrooms have a tendency of springing up in the wake of evidence of human interference with the natural world, as a kind of coevolution there of ecological homeostatic regulation. This is a particularly interesting set of slides. These are qualitative excerpts of transpersonal nature connection on psychedelics from a colleague who just graduated from University of Greenwich, Alex Irvin. So these can be considered as experiences of becoming nature. So one individual said about his LSD experience that he became the forest, the trees, the branches, the leaves. I went underground and I became the roots, the ground. Another few individuals said that they had their consciousness inhabiting other entities like wolves, stars, communicating with trees. Another saying about their submersions in nature, seeing life processes occurring in real time in plants. And then another, a complete breakdown of the nature-self divide, an incredibly visceral experience of metamorphosing into a wolf, classic kind of therianthropy. Another kind of theme that could be extracted from this is communication, so interspecies communication. On this person's DMT experience, they said that it allowed me to see the distinct personalities of the trees. They became sentient mantis-like beings, and after that, they were always able to perceive tree sentience. Another participant saying about their ayahuasca experience that Madre Ayahuasca showed me a lot of things about the relation of every being, how we affect everything through our energy. And another participant saying about their contact with alien life forms, watching humanity, reminding me that we are stewards of the earth. So these last two excerpts especially are kind of preempting or foreshadowing of what I'm going to be talking about entity encounter and also these near-death or alien-like experiences. So spiritual abduction, NDEs themselves could be considered a type of abduction on a spiritual level, as indeed abduction experiences have very spiritual components. So Stephen Greer, the ufologist, abduction researcher, he was quoted saying, "If you were lifted off the bow of the Titanic, were you abducted or were you rescued?" So I felt this is an extremely powerful quote here, and really comparing the earth to a sinking ship, and that when people have these types of abduction or even near-death experiences, there is a salvational quality, saving ourselves from ourselves. So speaking to this very, very profoundly, Kenneth Ring, in his Omega projects, he found that 70 to 80% of people who have near-death experiences, and up to 86% of people who have abduction-like experiences, they are shown to have increased concern for nature. And that's very interestingly not dissimilar percentages that we saw early on in this presentation about how psychedelics affect people's ecological concern. And again, so that's another means of identifying the similarity between psychedelic and these types of transpersonal experiences. But in terms of the actual, like, why would these experiences have this kind of consequence? So again, in Heading Toward Omega, earlier book by Kenneth Ring, there's a great deal of exploration about the specific visions, premonitory visions and messages, which are shown in these near-death and abduction experiences of certain catastrophe, of an ecological nature happening in the future. So these are just, it's replete with these kinds of experiences and excerpts. So I just chose one exemplary one for each dimension. So one said that she was shown Mount St. Helens, i.e. exploding, and on May the 18th, Mount St. Helens really erupted. I turned to my husband and said, "Mount St. Helens just blew its top," and the people there just laughed at me. Later that night, we were watching TV, and it was ultimately confirmed. So, and then Margot Gray is also another NDE researcher, importantly saying that one of her participants said, these activities of these calamitous activities of the planet are a reflection of the social upheaval and violence that's going on in the world. Importantly, like, there is this arc, as many of these examples there are of these cataclysmic visions of the future. Many of them report that at the end, there will, as this person says, that there's a renewal, a rebirth that actually occurs. So this participant said, at the end of this period of transition, mankind was to be born anew with a sense of a new place in the universe. Mankind would emerge humbled, yet educated, peaceful, and unified. A particular quote here is very important to emphasize for the purpose of what we're all doing here at this event in terms of another means of looking at the potential curtailing of these ecological disasters, is that to read this particular quote: I was shown events that are likely to happen in the near future, but was made to understand that nothing is absolutely fixed, and everything depends on how we choose to use our own free will. Even those events that are already predestined can be changed and modified by a change in our own way of relating to them. So if there is a necessary shift in understanding and consciousness and actions, that even these visions, they're just visions of possibilities as to our potentially current trajectory, but ultimately there is hope. So not just looking at these transpersonal experiences, but the entity encounter, which is characteristic of a lot of them. Not only will they yield personal transformation for the person having them, or even indeed messages that come through, and this is borne out in a very recent paper of DMT entity encounters, which I'll discuss in a second. But also, of course, in the shamanic perspective that I shared at the beginning, there can be, in a more kind of theurgical sense, an assistance which could be asked for by these entities theoretically. But in terms of actually inducing them as opposed to relying on their spontaneous occurrence, regression, for instance, is very routine for happening in the context of abductions. But also there's been a couple of recent studies with near-death experiences and regressing these experiences. And that was for the purpose of looking at the neural correlates of that. And interestingly, under the regressive condition, the vividity and the recall was significantly higher than in the non-regressed recall experience. Beauregard in 2009 actually, again for a neuroimaging study with near-death experience participants, asked them to deliberately connect with the being of light which they encountered in their experience. And they were successfully able to do so. And just incidentally, the theta and gamma bands were most prevalent in that connection experience. And that is quite mirroring of recent data for DMT, the EEG correlates of DMT, there, where theta and gamma alternately increased as well. Or one can turn to chemical theurgy, using mimetics of near-death experiences or these more ufological experiences through psychedelic means. So, for instance, this is our own data superimposed on that by Chris Timmerman, who published a paper recently of DMT modeling the near-death experience. So we also found similarly, indeed, our DMT participants scored even higher on many of the near-death experience scale items than even Chris Timmerman's paper. And so you can see DMT not only reliably induces near-death experiences, but there are these subdomains of encountering beings or the deceased, and indeed extrasensory type perception. This is an excerpt from a recent paper, which is in publication of mine and Dave Luke's, emphasizing not the near-death experience like nature of DMT, but indeed the abduction-like experience. So, for instance, certain roles of these entities which they play orchestrating or experimenting on the individuals, and how they look as being very insectoid or serpentine, or indeed grey or mantis-like. This is from the Davis paper, which I mentioned, the survey of entity encounters specifically on DMT, and basically mirroring my own observations of these entities being referred to as aliens or other beings, which are also not uncommon in spontaneous abduction encounter experiences. Importantly, though, he also asked about any particular messages or insights or missions which were communicated to the individual by these entities. And one of these particular messages was in the domain of interconnectedness. And why I think this is an important one to leave on is not just to show that these explicit messages are communicated by these entities, but actually that at least in these examples given, they aren't exactly messages which can be leveraged in a way that perhaps theologically and enlisting the help of these entities, maybe one might hope for achieving these particular ends, such as the understanding or mitigating of climate crises. But what they do certainly do is they transform the individual. They lead to profound ontological shifts and visceral personal understandings of the connectedness of all things. And indeed, if more people have these experiences, then hopefully the less the damage that we'll be doing on a collective level to our planet, given these new understandings. So yeah, so in that vein, could psychedelics be these crucial agents of this paradigm shift in consciousness, which in itself could be the greatest hope that we have for ameliorating the environmental problems. So for instance, quote here saying that the experience with psychedelics allows us to encounter visionary mystical insights about the human condition, Gaia consciousness, deep community, cosmic unity. Dave Luke here quoted saying, asking the question, really the fundamental question here that I'm also asking and wanting to end this presentation on, is it that psychedelics with the right set and setting can give rise to a sense of deep connection with nature, which may extend as far as interspecies communication, or indeed the maintenance of an animistic worldview. We must change or be changed, he also writes. And indeed, this is evocative of the title for the recent Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind, where psychedelics are indeed the prototypical agents for inducing change of one's mind. Indeed, they're being called psychoplastogens, in fact, by scientists in recent years. So really, we may well be able to find the answer to our abusive relationship with nature within nature herself, such as within these psychedelic plants and fungi. So really, the final note, asking the question, like, is it possible to harness this burgeoning renaissance that's happening in psychedelic science at present? These experiences that I've been discussing in this presentation, nature connection of more parapsychological experiences, transpersonal experiences, interspecies communication, entity contact, near-death type experiences, etc. These will be happening spontaneously, but more and more and more to more and more people with this mushrooming in psychedelic interest, such as in all of the exploding psychedelic studies, scientific studies being done, be them online, observational, clinical studies, but also all these psychedelic ceremonies happening and really blossoming all over the world. And indeed, a lot of those are being scientifically investigated as well. But of course, in the context of there being much greater rapidity now of the decriminalization of psychedelics, and indeed the medicalization of them, potentially even the full legalization of them. So, but the question is, can this be leveraged? Can this be optimized, maximized? And I think there's an extremely rich, fertile window for that to be happening, because if we were to engineer the set and setting, the priming, as it were, of these people having these experiences, and because indeed these substances have been referred by Hartogson, for instance, as active placebo catalysts. It's the set and setting which really can fundamentally drive the experience, and it can be driven toward all of these insights and experiences that I've just discussed with you today, and that can be done in a variety of means. And for instance, just the raising of awareness of these facts, or the specific making of specific calls, campaigns for people to be doing this. Again, there may be ethical considerations, but this is something that certainly can be discussed later down the line, especially tomorrow, for instance, at the Ideathon. So I'll end my talk there. Thank you very much indeed.
All right. So I think you're good, Pascal. Great. Do you want us to take the Q&A to the lounge session, or do you want to take at least the first question that is posted right now?
I don't mind. In terms of the receptivity, for your sake, is it not loud? Is it possible to communicate? Okay.
It's a little bit loud. I think you can turn off your audio and then turn it on when you need to answer. I think that would be a good strategy. In any case, I think that was a very interesting presentation. There's a lot of studies that you are doing all over there, and congratulations on that. Also, I just noticed that that the paper that you were working on, DMT, has just been published. So congratulations on that also. And well, let's jump to the to one of the posted questions here. So Dr. Mothridge is asking you if let me put it on stage. She says, I think it's so great that you brought the first side theory of James Carpenter. Thank you. Can you speak a bit to how to work on psychedelic integration to support psi post trip?
That's interesting that you would focus on the integration aspect as opposed to the preparation element in terms of optimizing the psi-conduciveness of psychedelics. I think that is interesting. However, though, like for instance, I think there's more evidence for things like near-death experiences, which although they do have certain dimensions which are replicated by psychedelic experiences, they do, at least the ones, because it's of course a spectrum, at least the deeper ones do seem to go to a further degree, as it were. And so as many parapsychological effects as there may be with psychedelics, I certainly think with near-death experiences, apologies for any noise, but with near-death experiences, there is certainly this element of an awakening, a loosening of these probably latent parapsychological effects, and so integration could certainly be incorporated in that. And as you say, I mean, originally when I read the question, I wasn't certain what the connection was between the unconscious element of psi, such as what First Sight describes, and the psychedelic integration. But naturally, if these NDEs or psychedelics, or indeed psychedelic induced NDEs, if they are mind manifesting in that way, and if they are unlocking certain the implicit extrasensory or elements in within our unconsciousnesses, then integration will clearly have a key part to play in bringing that out and structuring that productively. But yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of exactly how that would happen, I'd have to contemplate that more. But yeah, that's what I said.
All right. Do you mind if I hop in for a moment? Thank you for your talk, Pascal. You've prepared a couple of questions for discussion, and we are heading into a networking break. And so we have 3 tables right now. One of them is relates to Julia's talk a moment ago, and it's called Stimulating Scientific Creativity. And then related to the 2 questions that you have for us, Pascal, there is another table called Visions of Global Rebirth, and also the Psychedelic Renaissance. And so for the next 30 minutes or so, we encourage you to have a seat at any or maybe multiple of these tables if you feel like hopping around, as your interest dictates. So I think with that being said, we might be ready to end this session and go ahead and paste those questions and maybe get our attendees talking to each other again. What do you think, Ramses? Did I cover it?
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly a good idea. Also, we've posted Pascal's questions in the chat, so you can see them, and then we can discuss it on the table. So, without being said, thanks a lot, Pascal, for all the effort. We know you're traveling right now. Thank you for trying as much as you could to be here. And let's see you at the table, also, Dr. Julia Malbridge. So, see you guys in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thanks very much for seeing us out.